Can you think of a political or social cause that would make you right now drop out of college and leave the United States, your loved ones, your daily comforts, to go and risk your life in a foreign land for that cause? That's just what the Catalan artist Pierre Daura and thousands of people around the world did during the Spanish Civil War. Daura was a Spaniard living in France with his wife Louise and their young daughter Martha. And although he was a Spaniard who returned to his home to defend the Second Spanish Republic, he left everything in his life that was important to him to stand up for his convictions. That decision to join the fight against fascism would have long standing consequences and implications. It impacted his Spanish citizenship, it complicated his immigration to the U.S., and it influenced his art. In late January 1937, Louise wrote to her family in Virginia that they were outraged to read in the papers that the French High Commandment had proposed that, quote, all foreigners living in France within 48 hours after war is declared will be deported or put into concentration camps on islands off the coast of France. End quote. Now, this was a disturbing turn of events to the family who'd made their home in France for more than a decade. For the 42-year-old Pierre, France had been at his home for more than 20 years. And Pierre, Louise, and Martha were all foreigners in France. Pierre and Martha were citizens of Spain, whereas Louise was a native of Richmond, Virginia. A few weeks after Louise posted this letter to her family, Pierre left his family in their small village in France, intent on joining the militia of the Second Republic. And he said, quote, I can't stand here and watch my family in Spain be massacred. This is not a simple civil war. This is a foreign invasion. And I'm no anarchist, no communist, but now is the time for all liberal forces to unite, no matter what their creed. And I've got to go. End quote. So it was from this juncture of uncertainty of place and identity that Daura's artistic expression gave birth to a cynical alternative to his previous work. The painting Collier is an example of the art that Daura produced during the pre-war years. It was vibrantly colored landscapes, energetic abstract paintings, and compelling figure studies. In contrast, he painted the more vulgar images of war with a heavy hand. His complex and unsettling depictions of women and children who had been displaced by war occurred simultaneously with his family's displacement from their adopted home from France and his birthplace in Spain. In the Camp Sketches series, when the Spanish Republicans fell to General Francisco Franco in 1939, Pierre Daura renounced his Spanish citizenship, leaving him stateless. He wasn't a citizen of any country. And then, with the development of France's restrictive immigration policies in the late 30s and the looming threat of German incursion in France prior to World War II, Louise applied for U.S. visas for Pierre and their daughter. However, Pierre was a member of several organizations that U.S. immigration officials considered suspect, thereby jeopardizing his application for a visa. Now, Pierre was born in Spain in 1896, and in his late teens, he moved to Paris to study art. He was among a group of Spanish immigrants in France like Pablo Picasso and Salvador Dali, who maintained a strong identity and connection to their homeland. They followed the unrest in Spain during the 30s with great interest, and some historians hold that the Spanish Civil War, the culmination of the unrest in Spain, could be viewed as a dress rehearsal for World War II. During the 1930s, several factions within Spain were laying claim to power, and they were divided primarily between old guard come fascists and bastions of unlanded working class as well as upstart socialist leaning Republicans. And that's the side that Pierre was on. Now, within each party, leaders emerged and then fell depending on the successes of their military actions, some to falter forever and others to rise to prominence. And like General Franco, who led the nationalist forces in overthrowing the Second Spanish Republic. As a matter of fact, he would eventually come to rule in Spain as a dictator until his death in 1975. The war mobilized thousands of transnational volunteers, all with a common purpose, and that was to staunch the tide of fascism. At the urging of Communist International, a group that advocated for world communism, Spanish expatriates and men and women from Canada, Great Britain, Ireland, Mexico, and the United States converged on Spain. And in defiance of fascist movements in their respective countries, even German and Italian volunteers joined the international brigades. Despite Daura's age, and remember he was 42 years old and a partially paralyzed left arm and hand, he made a convincing case for his usefulness as a forward artillery observer to the 59th Mixed Brigades. As a forward observer, exposure to the elements, hunger, thirst, and constant vigilance took their toll. Daura was ill equipped to survive the elements, much less engage the enemy with a light revolver he'd managed to acquire on his own. Instead, he stayed alert on lonely mountain lookout posts, and at the approach of unknown travelers, Pierre would take cover under branches he fashioned over a dent in the earth just large enough to conceal and shelter his body. While Daura was likely also bone weary, he managed to document many of the scenes that you'll see here before being overtaken with fatigue. Soldiers at Rest served as a somber interpretation of the consequences of fascism. The engraving's deep cuts and heavy lines mark a departure from the usual nature of his art. On April 26, 1937, Franco's allies, the Nazi Luftwaffe, bombed the Basque market town Guernica in northern Spain. The air attack on the market and the strafing of women and children fleeing through the surrounding fields immediately emerged as a watershed event of unprecedented magnitude and viciousness. Besides Daura's cherished family, the other constant in his life were these instruments of his work. Daura wrote to his friend Bertold Kohn, a German member of the Republican Sacco-Vanzetti Brigade, quote, "I can't imagine that the brush in my hand painted the soft and curved lines of a landscape, because today it only wants to paint the rough, straight lines of war, blood, and destruction." End quote. It was no longer within Pierre's power to express in his art any but the most primal emotions which dominated his existence during this time. Next is a series of frontline sketches that Pierre refashioned into paintings and engravings he entitled Civilization. The title is a grim sort of irony directed to a world that was, at the moment, anything but civilized. Daura planned to sell prints of Civilization to American artist and political activist Rockwell Kent to raise money in the U.S. for the Spanish Republican government. Well, in much the same fashion, Picasso began a series of satirical prints, The Dream and Lie of Franco, to promote the Republican loyalists. Well, Kent's activities attracted the attention of the House of Un-American Activities Committee, and his passport would eventually be revoked. The child in the foreground of innocent victims is one example of Daura's subconscious impulse to conflate the vitality and spirit of his young daughter Martha with a pigtail schoolgirl threatened by civil war. To Pierre's horror, an instant before his unit bombed a Nazi barracks, he had in his sights a young girl fleeing in terror from the building that the night before had housed the German army. but he had the presence of mind to delay the shell that would have ended the life of the child who stood in place of the Germans. There's a remarkable resemblance between Martha Number 9, a sketch that he made earlier, and Innocent Victims. As Daura recalled, the child he witnessed fleeing from the village, quote, had an undue, very deep influence forevermore, more influence on my thinking, my feelings, and my purposes. My vision of my child and the person of that child that I was going to shell haunted me completely. And that girl, from now on, was given the name of my own little girl. End quote. By August of 1937, Pierre was back home in France recuperating from a bullet wound to the same arm that was partially paralyzed. But to give you an indication of Pierre's mental and physical toughness, he used a Swiss Army knife to dig shattered bone fragments out of the injured arm. And he saved those fragments and knife, and now they're in the Daura archive at the University of Georgia. During his recovery, he traveled around the French and Spanish border, searching for comrades on behalf of their families. And this large painting, Argolis, is an example of what he witnessed there. More than 300,000 civilians and military refugees had landed in the squalid concentration camps like Argolis. Daura wrote that he, quote, tried to be useful to all of the refugees that poured like a furious river through the Pyrenees toward the south of France, to and in concentration camps and distribution centers all over southern France, end quote. When the Spanish Republic fell to Franco, Pierre renounced his Spanish citizenship, and the Dauras decided it best to leave France. But Pierre and Martha's stateless status, as well as his affiliation with socialist organizations, became a sticking point for U.S. immigration officials. Lacking legal identification documents, they eventually were admitted to the U.S. with Nansen passports, which made no guarantees of eventual citizenship or even long-lasting residence in the U.S. Pierre was affiliated by various degrees with organizations targeted by the Attorney General's list of subversive organizations, particularly the Socialist Workers' Party and the International Brigades. But even though he emphatically denied membership in the Communist Party, he was active in organizations considered subversive by American officials. In this propaganda poster that Pierre made while in the United States, which is entitled Spirit of Freedom, Pierre set aside ideological differences and focused instead on his transition from refugee to citizen. Now, Pierre and Martha had sailed to the U.S. in 1939 as Spanish refugees. And as the refugee awaiting citizenship, he produced a series of war propaganda posters for the American government. Spirit of Freedom stresses the influence of the Allied powers to overturn fascism. A five-pointed star illuminates Lady Liberty on a white steed, which is a symbol for victory. One of the shackled figures clutches a menorah, while Daura may have been physically far removed from the arena of war. Mentally, his subconscious remained attuned to the brutality he witnessed in Spain by General Franco's nationalists and their German abettors. While in Rockbridge Baths, Virginia, he began to paint with brighter colors and with an energy that reflected a sense of security for his family and in his identity as a Catalan American. When Pierre and Martha became naturalized American citizens in 1943, a transformation occurred that's evident when comparing the grim etchings of civilization with paintings like Barn of Peace and Little House at Tuckaway. The colorful summer landscape depicts a small cabin near their home in Rockbridge Baths, surrounded by an abundance of nature, which is never evident in Daura's war art. Tuckaway is an indication of his revitalization as an artist and as a member of his community. Now, Pierre occasionally returned to dark themes, but his once instinctive attraction to innovation returned, and his art reflected an outlook from reserved optimism to delighted contentment. Well, thanks for watching. I hope you'll visit the Daura Museum of Art at the University of Lynchburg in the very near future.